I'm the National Executive Officer of AORA. Welcome to today's webinar on the capacity of the Australian organics recycling industry. It's the last and biggest of a national series of webinars. One's been held covering each state and territory, and this webinar covers the overarching national picture of the industry's capacity. Before I get to introducing Nick Behrens, who will deliver most of today's webinar, let me throw across to Alex Hammett, and Alex will give us some of the housekeeping for today's meeting.
Thanks, Peter. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So Nick and Peter are more than happy to answer questions at the end of the webinar. We have built in some time, so please, as we go through the webinar, jot your questions down into the Q&A box. If you could leave the chat for any tech issues, that would be great. I will be standing by to help if you need it. And we will run through the questions towards the end of the webinar. The report will be available as well following the webinar, and a recording will be made available early next week. So I'll pass you back to Peter and we will get started.
And thank you, Alex. Just to walk you through quickly, as Alex said, we've got a fairly detailed presentation, but we've made sure that we'll have plenty of time left for questions and answers. So please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your page. Type them in as we go along, and we'll certainly get to them at the end and answer them to the best of our ability. As Alex also mentioned, the report on which today's webinar is based will be on the AORA website, uploads permitting, by the end of this meeting, and we'll be providing a link to that, and by early next week a link also to this webinar so that you can re-watch it. And alongside that, for all AORA members, will be a copy of the webinar and the PowerPoint for each state and territory. So if you haven't attended any of those, or even if you have, and you have a particular interest in one or more states or territories, have a look at those materials. They'll be there free of charge as always to AORA members, and we'll send that link out via email to all members as soon as we can. This report, though, is one of a series of pieces of work that AORA has undertaken over the last 12 months or so. I think it's fair to say that for most of our industry, most of organics recycling in Australia, the last 12 months have actually been pretty good. A fair percentage of AORA members are operating at record throughputs, and the industry as a whole is doing pretty well. We don't want to talk about that too loudly, because obviously this has been a year where most industries have struggled, and a lot of businesses, if they haven't gone to the wall, are certainly not far away. So we as an industry are somewhat of an exception to the rest of the economy. That said, for AORA, it has been more of a struggle than it has been for our members. And the reason for that is simple. Most of what we do relies on getting face-to-face with our members, with the industry, with its suppliers, and with politicians and public servants who make decisions about our industry. And our capacity to do that in the last year has really been taken away. So we've had to do things in a different way to what we normally do. Obviously, one sign of that is a lot more webinars in the absence of face-to-face events. The other thing, which I guess is a more overarching issue, was the decision of the AORA board to use that hiatus, to use that slowdown as a result of lockdown, to review what AORA is and how it does its job. And on the back of that, the AORA board directed me to work towards four key pieces, four key foundational documents that would reinvent AORA so that it would both be more member-centric, but also a lot sharper and more effective at changing government decision-making in favour of our industry. The first of those pieces of work was our new 3-year strategic plan, which was developed early last year and commenced on the 1st of July. There's a lot of work going on towards that, and I look forward to reporting in a couple of months towards the end of the first year of that plan on where we are and what those results are. The second piece of work was a study into the economic contribution of our industry to Australia and to each state and territory. And to carry out that piece of work on behalf of AORA and our members, we brought on board Nick Behrens. And I'll introduce Nick in a minute. And Nick delivered an outstanding report that's really had a huge impact in how we talk with governments and how governments think about our industry. The report showed that in both economic and environmental terms, our industry makes a huge contribution, and we'll show you some of that in today's webinar briefly. It also showed that there's a whole lot of potentially greater contribution, economic and environmental, sitting on the shelf. And it modelled how that contribution could be upped if we increased our recycling rates from the current 51% to levels like 70, 80, 90 or 95%. And again, we'll look at some of that. So that was the second piece of work. The third piece of work is the one we're talking about today. And it's almost a follow-up or a sister document to the economic contribution study. Because of course, if you're going to uplift the recycling rate, one of the key components in doing that is the industry's ability to uplift production. And that's what this document looks at today. So it really fills in a lot of the gaps about our capacity to do good things for ourselves, obviously, but also for the wider Australian economy and community. The fourth piece of work will use all of these and outline a 10-year roadmap for the future of our industry's growth. And I look forward to that being launched in the coming weeks. But this third piece of work, like the second, was undertaken on our behalf by Nick Behrens, and on your behalf by Nick Behrens, let me say. Nick's the principal of Australian Economic Advocacy Solutions. He's a well-respected and well-known economist and industry advocate. He's worked in Queensland and many other states and nationally on behalf of a whole bunch of industries. And Nick's great strength as an economist is that he has the capacity to take economic data and turn it into solid common sense political and policy positions, policy arguments. And I think he's done that in an exceptional way for us. He's been a really top-notch addition, albeit temporary, to the AORA team. And I think he's delivered us two pieces of work, which, as you'll see in a minute, really positioned us well to represent your interests and to help grow the industry in the years ahead. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Nick Behrens.
Thank you, Peter. As Peter indicated, Australian Economic Advocacy Solutions specialises in linking economic research with advocacy. What we find is quite often a decision maker is only prepared to act if they understand the importance of the action that they're being requested to deliver. And one of the ways that you can quite often demonstrate that is, for example, casting an eye on the economic contribution that an industry sector may provide, as we did with the AORA membership last year, and then perhaps casting a light on why some key policy initiatives need to be delivered because of the economic benefit and the environmental benefit that may be unleashed if they were to act in the manner that was asked of them. So that's what we primarily do at AEAS. We do a lot of work for the three tiers of government, a lot for government-owned corporations such as ports, work for airports, and then a range of industry associations across Australia. In terms of this exercise, whilst most of us online will certainly have a very in-depth understanding of what it is that the Australian organic recycling industry does, nevertheless, it is important to define, I guess, the playing field for the purposes of the economic importance, but also the capacity and capability of the industry sector. So we've used the Australian Bureau of Statistics definition, and it's really two parts to the industry that are seamless in many respects. The first is that the industry receives waste product, it collects and processes and recycles those waste materials, and it turns it into a valuable commodity or input for other economic endeavours elsewhere in the economy. For example, for the Australian organic recycling industry, it would be mainly mulch and composting products that are used across a wide range of industry sectors. Now, in doing those two essential things, i.e. receiving waste, processing it, recycling it, and then turning it into an input to be used elsewhere in the economy, it delivers two things. It delivers substantial economic benefit and it delivers substantial environmental benefit. And what we sought to do last year was capture the economic contribution that the industry sector is making. And you can see here from this table that the Australian organic recycling industry is an important economic player in the Australian economy. It is generating 4,845 jobs. Collectively, it is paying in excess of $366 million in wages. That's an average livelihood in the order of about $75,000, which sits about $10,000 above Australian average weekly earnings. So it's a good, it's a good earnings that you can make in the industry. It's got over $2 billion in sales. It supports an extensive supply chain. It has, provides supply chain opportunity in excess or approaching $1.9 billion. That in itself is really important because that supply chain is comprised of businesses who in turn employ. Those employees in turn spend their wages elsewhere in the economy. So there's a substantial indirect economic benefit that is created as a result of the industry itself. So it's important to recognise that it's not only direct economic benefit, but indirect economic benefit. And no doubt in the not too distant future, we're going to start to look at what economists refer to as enabled economic benefit. So what is the economic benefit that is created from the utilisation of all of these products that the industry sector is generating? Putting that aside, the industry sector has an eye towards the future. It is investing in the order of $175 million each year. It unquestionably has a social license. It is contributing taxes, fees and charges to the three tiers of government that in turn are used to fund frontline service delivery. So it can tick the box of having a social license in that regard. And in net terms, it's providing $724 million in net contribution towards the Australian economy. So it is a key and important industry sector. But what we also know to be the case is that it's important in terms of the environmental benefits that the industry sector provides as well. What we know is that the Australian organic recycling industry, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that are saved each year, the sector is leading to 3.8 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions saved annually. If you're like me, quite often politicians or the broader community will not really have a good understanding of what 3.8 million tonnes actually means. Well, we've converted it using Green Industries SA methodology, and that translates to about 5,675 1,000 trees being planted each year. That's a lot of trees. Or in another metric, about 877,000 cars being taken off the road. So you have to think of the contribution not only in terms of economic but environmental benefit. Now, as substantive as those benefits are, we believe that the Australian organics recycling industry is only achieving a glimpse of what it is capable of achieving. And the reason we say that is at the moment, the Australian organic recycling industry, we have about a 51.5% recycling rate. And we can look to other states like South Australia, who already have a 78.9% recycling rate. And what we know is the more material that is recycled, the more material that is processed, the more products that are produced in terms of the compost and mulching materials, the more economic and environmental benefits that are achieved. So anything that we can do to lift the recycling rate not only benefits the environment, but it also benefits the economy. And so that's why AORA has put in place a number of targets, being 70% recycling rate, then an 80% recycling rate, then a a 90% recycling rate and then a 95% recycling rate. That's why it's got those key targets that it wants to see achieved. And the view is, but they're not utopic, because the feedback from SA, for example, is as impressive as their recycling rate is at 78.9%, they still think they've got opportunity to boost or improve their own recycling rate. And you can see that there are, unfortunately, some laggard states there that are achieving nowhere near what is the national rate, let alone what the South Australian rate is. So what we wanted to do was then model, well, what would the economic and environmental benefit look like if we were able to primarily hit that 80% target in the next 5 or so years, and then ultimately to hit a 95% recycling rate. And the next slide shows you that if we were successful in achieving a 95% recycling rate across Australia, then the economic gains are again quite substantial. It would generate 4,094 jobs. It would, which would pay in excess of $309 million in wages. It would create another $1.7 billion in sales. It would create another $1.6 billion in supply chain opportunity. And it would provide another $612 million into the Australian economy in net terms. In terms of environmental benefits, if we were to hit that 95% recycling rate, then again, that's about 3.2 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions that are being saved each year. And again, converting that into a metric that most of us can understand, that's about 4.8 million trees that are being planted each year, or about 741,000 cars being taken off the road. So the more we do to lift the recycling rate, the more economic and environmental benefits we are achieving. However, what industry associations quite often make the mistake of doing is asking government to do all of the heavy lifting. And it is not only the right policy settings that need to be delivered by local government, by state governments, and nationally. We also actually have to test if the industry is given the opportunity, i.e. through the right policies, is the industry really in itself positioned to be able to achieve that growth? And that was, I guess, the very essence for why we commissioned the capacity and capabilities assessment of the industry. We wanted to make sure that the industry, if given that opportunity, can step up. The rest of this presentation really does that. It shows you, where the gaps are and where the opportunities arise. But also in not only testing capacity and capability of the industry sector, we also have to test whether or not there is market demand for the industry's products to be purchased. So you really need the right policies, the capacity, capability, and market appetite, all of those 4 boxes to be ticked if we're to be successful in achieving those national recycling rates of 80 and 95%. So to define the task at hand, well, here you can see in the top table, at the moment, nationally, the industry is recycling or processing a little over 7.5 million tonnes of organic material each year. If we were to hit the 70% recycling rate, that would have to lift to about 10.2 million tonnes each year. If we were to, going across the columns, if we were to hit the 80%, we'd need to be recycling and processing 11.7 million tonnes of organic material. For 90%, it would be 13.1 million tonnes of organic material. And for 95%, we'd need to be processing or recycling each year 13.9 million tonnes of organic material. In terms of net increases, respectively from 70 to 95%, that's an additional 2.7 million tonnes, rising to just under 4.2 million tonnes, again rising to 5.6 million tonnes, and then eventually lifting to 6,354,000 tonnes that are being processed. So again, that's really the extent of the challenge. The industry, if we're to hit 95%, is going to have to be recycling an additional, just under 6.4 million tonnes of organic material each year. And so that's no certainty. We need to go out and validate whether or not that is actually achievable from the existing industry as it stands today. So what we did is we commissioned a survey that went out to the AORA membership and others to ask them to assess what their existing capacity was, what they thought their future capacity could be if all of the challenges and obstacles were taken out of the equation, namely through the right policy initiatives, and also to ask the producers what they thought was the market appetite for their products. Could they lift their production and that production be soaked up with market appetite for the compost and mulching materials? And the results are in the following slides. The survey was completed by approximately 15 to 20% of the total tonnes that are being recycled each year. So businesses account for about 15 to 20% of the recycling capacity. So it was a good sample that we were able to achieve through the survey. And also pleasingly through the survey, we were able to elicit a lot of other qualitative data that shines a light on some of the policy positions that do need to be unleashed, that no doubt Peter will be releasing next month. Okay, so getting into it, you can see here, and again, most of us will know, but the majority of the product that is sourced, the feedstock is sourced from councils, and then the remainder is commercial industrial suppliers. In terms of what is the substantive element of the material that is recycled, it's garden organics, followed by what would be timber, waste sludge and biosolids, and also food organics. And again, they're largely influenced a lot by where the council may happen to be in terms of their collection services. So namely through the survey vehicle, we were able to establish that there's only 305 businesses across all of Australia that are operating in the Australian organic recycling industry. And you can see here through this chart that they're currently processing 7.5 million tonnes of organic material. And they believe that if all of the obstacles and constraints were to be removed, they would have about an additional 3.8 million tonnes of collective processing capacity each year. So and this slide breaks down by state, both the current tonnes that are processed and the additional supply capability that the industry has assessed itself to have. So when you couple what it does at the moment with what they think they can do, and then match it up against the required task at hand to achieve the recycling rate, you are able to come up with what the shortfall or surplus may be. And that's what this slide essentially summarises, in that let's look nationally, which is the last row in this table. Based on the 7.5 million tonnes that it's currently recycling, coupled together with the 3.8 million tonnes that it believes it's got additional capacity to produce, you can see here that the industry has sufficient capacity to be able to hit that 70% recycling rate. It would have about 1.1 million tonnes of capacity over and above the requirement. You can see here though, but if you were to hit the 80%, so if we were to strive for the 80% recycling rate, we would start to transition from having sufficient capacity to being just short of capacity. So the existing, coupled together with additional capacity, for 80%, unfortunately, there would be a 332,000 tonne shortfall in terms of recycling capacity. And again, the higher the recycling rate goes, the more that shortfall becomes. So for 90%, the shortfall then becomes 1.8 million tonnes, and then for 95%, it goes out to 2.5 million tonnes. So what this really infers is that well, there's obviously opportunity for the existing industry to grow, but if we were to strive for the 80 and 95% recycling rates, we'd probably have to have new capacity, additional capacity from outside the industry entering the industry to be able to get, I guess, the grunt required to process and recycle the organic material. But again, as I alluded to, it is not only what the industry's capacity is, it has to be able to sell that product to market. And so the second element of the exercise was to ask the producers what additional sales do they think they could achieve to be able to hit those recycling rates. And again, to, I guess, define the extent of the challenge. At the moment, there's about 6,460,000 tonnes of organic products that are sold across Australia, and you've got the statewide the breakdown there. To hit 70%, that would need to lift to about 8.8 million tonnes of products sold. For 80%, they would need to lift to just over 10 million tonnes. For 90%, they would need to lift to 11.3 million tonnes of organic products sold. And for 95%, it would have to go as high as 11.9 million tonnes of products sold to the market. And again, in terms of net increases, respectively from 70 to 95%, that's an additional 2.3 million tonnes being bought, rising to 3.6 million tonnes, rising to 4.8 million tonnes, then and inevitably rising to 5.4 million tonnes of organic products to hit that 95%. So again, that is substantive market demand that would need to be established for us to be able to hit those notional recycling rates. Again, just before we have a look at whether or not there is market demand, what I just want to identify here is that at the moment through the survey, we were able to shine a light on in terms of the breakdown of sales by product in the 1920 financial year. You can see there that the majority of the products are in composted soil conditioners and soil blends. And in terms of product sales by market categories, urban amenity and intensive agriculture are the two big market segments that the industry is selling into. And again, we can break that data down if required. So through the survey vehicle, we asked producers, we asked the existing industry what additional sales they thought they could achieve. And what you have here is, well, at the moment, they're selling 6.5 million tonnes, and they believe, based on where the market stands today, they'd be able to sell an additional 3.4 million tonnes of mulch and compost products each year. And again, this slide really provides an indication or slices and dices the data by state, number of businesses in each of those states, tonnes sold, and additional sales possibility. Again, we then contrast that with how many tonnes of product would need to be sold to hit each of the notional recycling rates. And again, this is the chart that really demonstrates whether or not we have sufficient demand or the demand is actually insufficient to meet the target. And again, nationally, what you can see here is existing coupled together with potential demand would, for 70%, we'd have sufficient market demand and a surplus of probably a million tonnes. But again, once we hit this 80% recycling rate, there would be insufficient market demand to purchase those products. And again, for 90%, we'd have a shortfall in market demand in the order of 1.4 million tonnes. And for 95%, we'd have a shortfall in market demand in the order of over 2 million tonnes of product. So again, what this really tells us is, if we really want to hit those upper recycling rates of 80 to 95%, the industry and government is going to need to promote the benefits of using the composts and the mulches, the environmental benefits that they deliver, the yield benefits that they deliver. So all of these host of benefits that we know exist if you use these sorts of products, we need to better educate the market so they have more appetite. But we also need to go out into industry sectors that historically haven't used the products of the Australian organic recycling industry, and let them know that what there is on offer and how that may potentially improve what it is that they do. So what the summary of all of that really is, if demand is greater than supply, or demand isn't meeting supply, then we don't have equilibrium, and we don't have any, it undermines the possibility or likelihood that we're going to hit those recycling rates. And what I really mean by that is, if the industry is unable to produce the amount of products that are required to hit the recycling rate, then we're not going to hit that recycling rate. If the market doesn't have sufficient demand for the compost and mulching materials, then we're not going to hit those recycling rates. So what we see there is that 3 boxes need to be delivered, and that is the right government policies. We're going to need to establish additional market capacity, and we're going to have to establish additional market demand. Now, the 4th area is the box that the industry can tick at the moment, and that is in the area of capability. So let's have a look there. And what we thought was one of the best ways to evidence capability was to ask the industry what they regard as the constraints. What are the obstacles for it to be able to grow? What are those constraints that would need to be addressed by government, for example, for the industry to be able to ramp up its production, and for market to be able to establish itself to purchase those products. And what you can see here is that the issues that are really holding the industry back aren't ones that are internal, but are rather external. And you can see here operational issues such as access to technology, labour costs, logistics. They're considered to be very minor obstacles to growth at present, and indicate that the industry's constraints are less internal. And the industry constraints are really considered, based on the survey, are considered to be external. So the largest obstacles to the operation and growth of the industry at the present include regulatory policy uncertainty. Here in Queensland, we're yet to have an organics action plan. Contamination of input material. Again, there's widespread evidence that there's a lack of responsibility for contamination in the feedstock. And that directly undermines the viability of the industry. Government policy, waste and recycling strategies, well, there's been a lot of action in those areas, and a lot of the states are only in the infancy of doing what it is that they do. And again, if we look at South Australia as the benchmark, well, it's no secret as to why they're able to achieve a 78.9% recycling rate of organic material. They have had long-standing, over several decades, commitment to sustainability. And over those several decades, they've forged very close linkages with the industry. So you have seen the recycling rate increase, and that is really the benchmark that AORA believes other states need to follow. We've also got business licensing and operating permits and development applications. So local government unquestionably has a role to play. Government procurement has a role to play. There's widespread examples of, procurement arms within local council not procuring recycled products that, other areas of the council in the waste and recycling area are actively trying to promote. So we need that consistency of procurement matching government's desire to do the right thing by the environment and increase recycling rates. So all short contract council periods, all of these things are really enablers for the industry to be able to grow. We also asked a number of other questions. What we saw from those earlier slides is that there's going to need to be substantial capacity. There's going to be substantial growth required in the industry. But the industry came back and told us they've got good familiarity with managing growth. In the last 3 years, the majority of the respondents to the survey said that they had experienced moderate and significant growth, and their expectations over the next several years, again, they're going to be very intimately familiar with significant and moderate growth. So the industry believes itself to be able to achieve that growth. We asked the industry to indicate whether it was satisfied with a range of metrics within the industry and for the business. And you can see here that 3 and 4 businesses indicate that they are somewhat, mostly, or very satisfied with their overall performance. We've got a range of indicators there being business growth, contribution to community development, lower costs of production, business stability, creating job opportunities, industry leadership, and productivity. Again, there's pretty good satisfaction with each of those. I guess the one area where it doesn't look like there is as high satisfaction is in the profitability of the industry. And I guess that really feeds into this slide, and that is the industry's current stage of development for a range of business functions appears to be very mature, indicating strong readiness to seize opportunity. So again, industry-specific techniques, business admin, financial management and procurement, processing, logistics, transportation and warehousing, forecasting, planning and scheduling. Well, the industry has come back to us and said, look, they've got developed management and control systems in place. They've got fully developed site-wide management and control systems in place. The one exception is innovation for new and enhanced products and processes. And I guess what it is that the industry has done in terms of its product range will not be what is required by the market in future years. And the industry will need to continue to evolve in terms of its product range to make sure that it is always delivering to what market appetite is or requirement is. So in terms of these 4 boxes that we talk about, the summary of this exercise is that there's only one box that is really being, we can put a tick into. At the moment, does the industry have the right policies in place for it to be able to grow, to achieve those recycling rates? Not across all Australian states it doesn't. And so nationally we don't. Does the industry have the capacity at the moment to achieve those increased recycling rates? Again, for the lower recycling rates, yes, it does. For the higher recycling rates, no, we don't. And for some states, there really is a significant challenge ahead to be able to tick that box of having the capacity. So that infers that the industry will need to grow. We will need to attract new market players into the industry sector. Does the industry have demand from the market for its products? It does, again, to achieve that 70% recycling rate, but for the 95% recycling rate, we're going to need to continue to grow market appetite for the product range of the organic recycling industry. The box that we can tick, at the moment unquestionably is in the area of capability. The industry does have the maturity, does have the experience to be able to, if given the opportunity, to step up, to start to chip away at lifting Australia's overall organic recycling rate. Peter, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I should have mentioned right up front, so I'll do it now, given I forgot, the thanks of AORA to the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment and Green Industry South Australia, who have both been financial and, I guess, moral partners in this important piece of work. Their contribution has made it, I guess, a lot easier and a lot less burdensome on AORA members in the industry to undertake this important piece of work. The other thing, of course, it means is that in the halls of government, the contents of this report become key data around decision making from day one. With that, we're just about on time, which is good news. I'll throw back to Alex, who's going to be our ringmaster for questions. I'll ask her to read them out so we can all hear them, and Nick and I will do our best to answer.
Thanks so much, Peter and Nick. We do have quite a few questions, so I'm going to try and group them into different kind of categories, just so that we can tick them off as we go. So a couple of questions just clarifying some of the data and stats that you provided, Nick. So David just wanted to confirm, are these all of the figures that you've mentioned, are they all based on 2018-19 waste volumes?
Yes, so the first body of work that AORA commissioned, being the economic importance, is sourced from Australian Bureau of Statistics, metrics relating to the 18-19 financial year and the National Waste Report. So for the purposes of both exercises, 18-19 is the baseline of the information that we've established, and there's commitment there to repeat, so we can longitudinally assess both the economic contribution and environmental contribution, but also the capacity and capability, and see how what policies improve the capacity, so we can start to make some pretty informed decisions. But that year is the baseline for the work that we're doing.
Just to reiterate that, the intent, as Nick hinted at there, of the AORA board is to undertake these studies on a biannual basis, so every second year. And the intent, therefore, is to create trend data over time that shows where the industry is going, what its contribution looks like, and I guess give you some what next capacity in terms of how you use the data. Alex.
Terrific. This one's more of a clarification. Can you just confirm, Nick, that the proportion of the industry that responded represented about 10, or was it 15% of the industry?
It's 16, nearly 17% of the total organic material that is recycled in Australia.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, a question from Bill. What businesses are included as organics processors? He was surprised at how high the number of businesses are in many states and territories.
Yep.
So are we, by the way, Bill, when we first dealt with it, I should just add. Nick.
Yeah, look, again, we use the ABS definition, and so if they're involved in the activity of processing and recycling organic material, if they're in the and in turn are generating those products, then that's the definition of that we're seeking to define the industry as.
If I could just add to that, the quick back of envelope calculation we did nearly a year ago now was that whilst the ABS reports low 302 or something like that businesses, back of envelope, probably 20% of those are not operating businesses. They exist in terms of name and approvals, but they're not actually producing anything.
Okay, following question from Bill. Many of the additional tonnes of organics to be diverted are food organics, which is a lot of water and volatile carbon that will not translate to a linear increase in tonne or volumes of compost to be processed. You can't assume that the current ratio of tonnes of input, tonnes equals to tonnes of output, will apply to new diversion. Do the figures allow for this?
Well, just from a technical point of view, we've used what is the current state of play in the industry as we know it today and are extrapolating that forward. Now, that is somewhat of a leap of faith, but in itself it evidences that we are only as good as the data that we have, and there's widespread recognition that we need to chip away at the accuracy of the data. So we use what we know today and cast that forward, and then hopefully as we embark on that journey forward, much of the information that we truly need to make these assumptions presents itself.
Okay. Is anaerobic digestion taken into account as an organic material recycling option?
Peter?
Yes, it is. Look, in simple terms, this will be addressed in a bit greater detail in the upcoming 10-year industry roadmap. But what we deal with is a hierarchy of reuse and recycling of organic materials. The highest value, of course, is full recycling, and anaerobic digestion fits under that banner, that broad banner. There are then other solutions that are not, I guess, what you could call full recycling solutions, but are better than landfill. And that's things like energy from waste are also looked at as options for, I guess, the hardcore material that can't in any foreseeable way be used for recycling. So short answer is yes, but there'll be more detail in the upcoming 10-year roadmap.
Okay. Muriel asked, what were the identified barriers? Could you speak to that a little bit more, Nick?
Could you bring up that slide, Nick?
Yeah.
I'd like to just make a comment here. Look, I've been involved in this sort of work in a number of industries now, and I've got to say I've never actually seen results quite as stark as these in any other industry. What this says is that the normal internal barriers to growth in most industries, things like access to finance, access to skills and labour, access to product development knowledge and technical capacity to do so. All those internal things are not considered significant problems within the industry. The things that are considered significant problems, and they're all the ones where you see a fair bit of red on the right, go to things like government policy, government approvals, regulatory policy, industry policy set by government contracts. So two things in common there. They're external and they're government at one or more of the three levels, which means that in order to go from where we are, 51.5%, to where we want to be, and I don't think I'm letting a cat out of the bag by saying that our targets in the 10-year roadmap will be 95% by 2030 and 80% by 2025. To get to either of those, clearly, if the barriers are all somewhere under government control, our relationship with government is a key to that growth. And it's in their interest as well as ours to make that happen because of the economic and environmental benefits that we've already seen. But this is really stark. It's rare that you get a dichotomy this clear of internal versus external factors holding back an industry. Nick, did you want to add anything?
No, look, and that the reports will go up, and the report shines a somewhat of a more informed description on each of those challenges.
Two last questions. You've established that the market demand needs to be developed. Can you comment on the best ways to develop end markets? And do we plan to undertake any future work in this area?
I'll answer that one if you don't mind, Nick. It's one of the three areas that we look at in detail in the 10-year roadmap. And the three areas, we split the supply chain of the industry into three areas. The input supplies, so everything around the education, collection, distribution and delivery of the input materials, the feedstock. The second is the production itself, so the process to take the input material and turn it into an end product. And the third is the end user markets, including the logistics to get the product to the end user markets, and the control mechanisms around the product itself. And the third of those is what you're talking about here. And like the other two, there's some quite detailed consideration and recommendations that I look forward to showing you in the 10-year roadmap, which will roll out next month.
Terrific, thanks, Peter. Three last questions coming in. Andrew asked the question of, well, a statement first with a follow-up question. Longer contracts would support the expansion of an individual business, but probably would not support the expansion of the collective industry because new players cannot readily secure a contract to de-risk investment. Can either of you comment on this?
I can.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, what we know is that, I mean, if you attend a meeting where you've got a range of organic recyclers sitting around a table, they will unquestionably tell you that they are not prepared to reach into their pockets to make investments that are required to, required to lift the overall amount of tonnes that are being processed. They're not prepared to make those investments unless they are able to achieve an ROI, and that ROI can only be established under over a contract period that needs to be greater than 1 year, which increasingly is the norm at the moment from local government. There needs to be sufficient opportunity for those businesses to be able to recoup their investments, and the procurement framework at the moment isn't enabling those businesses to put in place that infrastructure that is required.
If I can just add to that, I think the thing to keep in mind when you think about this question is the massive differences in maturity and capitalisation, and therefore of the production throughput of our industry between states. Go back to those early figures. You've got SA at nearly 80% recycling of organic materials, and it is way out ahead of any other state. And that's a result of 40 years of good policy and good relationships. You've got ACT up there, but ACT is a bit left field because it's basically one medium-sized, very heavily subsidised city. At the other end, you've got serially underperforming states, again, based on the reverse of good policy and good relationships, bad policy and bad relationships in Queensland and WA. And in the middle, you've got the two big states, New South Wales, which sat for a long time just under 50%, and has seen really good hard work over the last 4 years, push that up to nearly 60% by now. And on the other hand, you've got Victoria, which for a long time was seen as one of the leaders of new approaches around recycling, but really has, I guess, been stuck in a rut, and that shows in the data, the productivity data. It's been stuck in that rut for a number of years now in the high 40s. And those figures reflect the maturity and the capitalisation of the industry in each of those states. And you don't capitalise and you don't employ unless you've got certainty. And in the states where the industry is immature, it's because there's uncertainty at a number of levels, and primarily in a state like Queensland, that uncertainty is around the supply of input materials. So you don't develop your business, you don't invest in it, you don't employ, and you don't develop end user markets unless you're sure you can actually get the product to recycle. And uncertainty around government supply contracts, local government supply contracts, means that doesn't happen. So yeah, in a mature market, long-term contracts can actually stymie competition, but in an immature market in a number of states, the lack of certainty is actually what's holding one of the things holding the industry back from growing and developing.
Okay. Another question from Andrew. Would you consider OH&S capability in future work, as capacity and number of players are rapidly increasing the need to focus on OH&S?
It's previously been flagged in one of the state webinars, but it would be nice to get a capability assessment on industry's commitment to workplace health and safety. So,
excellent. Peter, have you got anything to add to that?
No, look, we intend to improve this in each iteration, and that's one of the ones that's been raised a few times now. So I think you should assume that in the version of this we do in 2 years, it will be there. Okay,
terrific. Just a quick nudge. If anyone else has got any last questions, please pop them in now. We have another question. You've identified policy settings as one of the major barriers to improving recovery. The Victorian government recently released a new policy, Recycling Victoria, which has significant focus on improving the recovery of organics. In your view, will this see improvements, or is there still more work required for Victoria?
In my view, it won't see improvements, and I'll explain why. Every state government has regularly released policy documents around improving recycling rates, improving capture rates, and delivering economic environmental benefits. AORA has been responding to that stuff and informing those policy documents since before it was even AORA. Compost Australia was doing that. So you've got useful documents where we agree with the objectives and we largely agree with most of the strategies, but they continually in most states not being delivered. And the reason is that they produce these reports, but then don't line up government decision-making across state government agencies, and more especially across local governments, to support those strategic objectives and outcomes. And if you don't do that, if you don't make sure that every decision made by state and local government at every level supports those outcomes, all you've got is a pretty document. The reason SA generally works is that you've actually got, it's not perfect by the way, SA's still got a way to go, but you've actually got most government decisions, state and local, lining up to the agreed outcomes. Until you do that, behind the pretty document, all you'll have is a pretty document. And I've got to be honest, at this stage, I don't yet see the work going into how that alignment of decision-making is going to be delivered behind that document in Victoria.
Thanks, Peter. I've got a Queensland-specific question now. Has AORA discussed FOGO collection and treatment with local or state government in Queensland? And then a follow-up to that is, does AORA have any insight or information on the continuance of the waste levy exemption for local government post the deadline for this to be reviewed?
The first answer is yes, and that's an ongoing discussion. In fact, we're presenting at the Local Government Association of Queensland Waste Conference to most of the waste managers across the state in a few weeks. And we have a pretty good and strengthening relationship at the state level with the key bureaucrats. The second one, just as a scene setter for those not from Queensland, in the last 5 terms of government in Queensland, there have been 5 widely different policies on landfill levy. It's changed basically every term, and you've seen some of the impacts of that with the cross-border traffic of waste to a lot of places around Ipswich. And it's one of the reasons why Queensland is so far down the totem pole in its performance. When the current government reintroduced the landfill levy, there was shouting and screaming from local government about the cost of this. So as a quote unquote temporary solution, they've effectively agreed, and they're doing this now, to pay a reimbursement to local government for the cost of what it takes to landfill from the landfill levy. and that reimbursement is 105%. So what you've in fact got is a tax on landfill designed to make landfill less attractive and divert from it. But councils who control that mechanism are being paid a profit from the tax for whatever they keep taking to landfill. It's in a state that's full of some really strange stuff. It's one of the strangest I've ever seen. We've made it clear at state and local level that we think that's a ridiculous outcome. I think it's fair to say that WRIQ to some extent has done the same, although they're limited by some of their membership on how strong they can go. And we're going to keep going on that because frankly, it's a farcical situation. And for us, it's got to end sooner than later, and you'll see some comment on that in the 10-year roadmap as well next month.
Thanks, Peter. That brings us to the end of the questions. So unless anyone's got any last minute questions, that will wrap it up for today. But if you do have questions that you do want to ask of Nick or Peter privately, Nick, can you just jump to the slide with your phone numbers on it?
Yes.
Or you can contact Peter directly at peter@aora.org.au. I have just dropped the link into the chat section for the report. So that is sitting behind the member firewall on the AORA website. If you are having any trouble accessing that, please send me an email at alex@aora.org.au and I will make sure you are linked to the member portal. Otherwise, are there any final comments from either yourself or Nick, Peter?
Just a thank you to everyone for attending. Please do read the report when you get the chance to see it. And as mentioned by Alex, Nick and I are more than happy to take a call or an email once you have that more detailed information and to answer any questions you may have. Thank you and good afternoon all.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone.